All right, hearing will come to order. Welcome everyone to the subcommittee's meeting today to hear testimony on U.S. policy in Iraq. I thank our witness for appearing today. Before recognizing myself for the purpose of making an opening statement, I'd like to just take the opportunity to recognize and thank the members of our committee who served in Iraq. We're grateful for your service, and your input today is going to be invaluable. I will now, I'll make an opening statement and then turn it over to the ranking member, Mr. Wilson, so that he can make an opening statement. Also, before I begin on my comments here, I'd like to just take a moment to express my condolences to the families and friends of the sailors killed at Naval Air Station Pensacola last Friday. The 3 sailors had dedicated their lives to serving their country, were taken from us far too soon, and moving forward, we need answers about the shooter and how this attack happened. The President was quick to share Saudi condolences and laud Saudi condemnation of the shooting. Certainly, at this point, the President and all of us must require the Kingdom to give full and transparent cooperation with the United States investigation so that we can understand what happened, identify any problems with the vetting process for our military education programs, and most importantly, bring the killer to justice. Since October 1st, tens of thousands of people have taken to the streets in cities throughout Iraq. These protests, largely driven by youth, have called for political reforms, an end to endemic corruption, improved service delivery, and greater economic opportunity. Reassuringly, the demonstrators have echoed unifying patriotic themes and explicitly rejected the sectarian divisions that have plagued the recent history of Iraq. These persistent, peaceful protests led to the resignation of Prime Minister Mahdi on December 1st. Unfortunately, security forces have met these demonstrations with violence, leading to the deaths of at least 400, the arrest of thousands, and injuries to as many as 20,000 people. Iraqi authorities have also suspended multiple media outlets, including Al Hurrat TV. They've closed others. Iraqi leaders must refrain from using violence against peaceful protesters, must hold those who have used force, especially deadly force, accountable, must permit the right of the people to peaceably assemble, and ensure the continued operation of media and the internet throughout Iraq. The brave protesters in Iraq should know that Congress and the American people stand with them in their calls for improved governance, better economic opportunities, and a brighter future. After decades of U.S. involvement in Iraq, we must support an Iraqi-led process that advances the aspirations of the Iraqi people. A notable aspect of the demonstrations is that they have decried Iranian influence in Iraq. Protesters in Baghdad's Tahrir Square and elsewhere have chanted, "Iran out, out." They have called for the resignation or removal of Iraqi politicians and militia leaders seen as too close to Tehran. They have voiced support for the sovereignty and the independence of Iraq. Unfortunately, Iran has accelerated its intervention since the demonstrations began. Tehran has urged Iraqi officials to take a harder line in cracking down on the protests. In the aftermath of the resignation of Prime Minister Abdul Mahdi, Iran continues to try to shape the course of political developments in Baghdad, demonstrated by multiple trips of Qasem Soleimani, commander of the IRGC Quds Force, to Baghdad as demonstrations have accelerated. Iranian meddling is hindering the emergence of a peaceful, independent, prosperous Iraq, just as it has undermined the sovereignty and stability of Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen. In recent weeks, the New York Times has reported on hundreds of leaked intelligence reports that demonstrate the extent of Iranian influence in Baghdad. The public has also learned that Tehran built up an arsenal of short-range ballistic missiles in Iraq in order both to deter the United States, hold American troops at risk, and potentially strike our regional allies and partners. In fact, just this morning, United States officials stated they now believe that Iranian-linked groups are behind multiple recent missile attacks against military bases housing American troops in Iraq, operations that have grown increasingly sophisticated. And according to Radio Farda, there have been at least 9 attacks against U.S. targets in Iraq in the past 6 weeks. Given these challenging developments, a fully staffed U.S. diplomatic presence in Baghdad is vital to persuade Iraqi leaders to forego violence against protesters, meet the threats posed by the interference of Iran and other unhelpful actors, and secure U.S. interests. Unfortunately, on May 14th, the State Department issued an ordered departure and instructed all non-emergency U.S. personnel to leave Iraq in response to increased security threats. According to the November 2019 Operation Inherent Resolve Inspector General report, as of October 3rd, there were 352 direct hire U.S. citizens and foreign service nationals under Chief of Mission Security Responsibility in Iraq, compared to 563 the day before the order of departure, a reduction of close to 40%. According to the Inspector General report, the order of departure has affected all operations of Mission Iraq and has limited the mission's ability to help Iraq become a more resilient, independent, democratic country and to support counter-ISIS efforts. The Inspector General report also noted that the order of departure temporarily delayed the vetting of individuals within the Iraqi security forces for ties to terrorist organizations, which the State Department conducts when a foreign force is to receive U.S. funding. Strengthening the ISF is crucial to preventing security vacuums that both Iran and ISIS can exploit. Yet, according to the report, these delays severely affected the training and equipping of ISF personnel. I'm cognizant of security threats to U.S. diplomats in Iraq. I take them seriously, but I'm disappointed that the State Department has not been fully transparent in why it first issued the order of departure and how it plans to stabilize the U.S. diplomatic presence in Iraq moving forward. Protecting U.S. diplomats and achieving our national objectives in Iraq is a joint duty of the executive and legislative branches, and I urge and expect the State Department to work better with Congress moving forward. State Department officially terminated the order of departure in November, but I'm worried the current diminished diplomatic presence has tied our hands. A strong U.S. diplomatic effort is critical to support and defend the protest movement, promote improved governance and anti-corruption, prevent the resurgence of ISIS, and limit the intervention of Iran and other adversaries in Iraq. I look forward to the testimony of our witness, his explanation of how we will achieve our national goals with a diminished U.S. presence, and his suggestions for the way forward in Iraq. And with that, I turn it over to the ranking member, Mr. Wilson, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Ted Deutsch, for calling this important and timely hearing on the way forward in Iraq. Since early October, we have witnessed the people of Iraq have taken to the streets, expressing their democratic rights as guaranteed to them by the Iraqi Constitution. Citizens of Iraq across the country have been protesting the rampant public corruption that has paralyzed their country and prevented Iraq from realizing its full potential. They are asking for the government to finally work for them, as it should have been from the very beginning. The protesters on the streets have been very clear from the very first protest that they intend to take back their country from Iran. Chants of out Iran, Baghdad remains free have been heard almost daily. For too long, the Iranians have been exerting an outside influence in Iraq, fostering networks of corrupt politicians and militia leaders to do the Ayatollah's bidding. Iranian-backed militias like Asab Yeb al-Haq and others have acted with impunity and operate outside of the formal Iraqi chain of command. These armed militias serve only in answer to Tehran and pose a real challenge to Iraqi sovereignty and stability. Tragically, the Iraqi security forces, as well as the Iran-aligned popular mobilization units, formerly under the Iraqi Minister of Interior, have reacted to these democratic protests in a brutal, repressive fashion. Sensing a threat both in Iraq and Lebanon, where anti-government protests tinged with anti-Iranian sympathy have broken out, Iran has decided to reinforce its interference. What we know is that the PMF and Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps established a joint operating cell in Baghdad in early October. Since then, the crackdown has presided over killing over 430 civilians and wounding nearly 20,000. This, of course, the only way the theocratic, tyrannical regime knows how to deal with expressions of democracy, as we see from the Supreme Leader's violent crackdown on protests in his own country. My two oldest sons, Alan and Addison, served in Iraq and developed a warm appreciation for its citizens. We want a vibrant future for Iraqi families. Iraqi Prime Minister Abdul Mahdi tendered his resignation late last month, describing it as a method of peaceful handover of power and a democratic system. But a new Iraqi government may be hard to form and would likely be just as corrupt and beholden to Iran as the current one. At any rate, it does not appear that the protesters in the streets of Iraq are satisfied by this announcement. The United States must make it a priority to stand for human rights, accountability, and meaningful government reform in Iraq. We have been handed, in my opinion, a golden opportunity in which the people of Iraq have stood organically against corruption and Iranian influence. We must seize the moment. That is why my colleague, Representative Tom Malinowski, and I have introduced H.R. 5276, the Iraq Human Rights and Accountability Act of 2019. This important bill sends a strong message to the Iraqi people by requiring a State Department review to determine if certain PMF and Interior Ministry leaders meet the criteria for imposition of sanctions pursuant to the Global Magnitsky Human Rights and Accountability Act. I was grateful to see that the Trump administration moved last week to impose human rights sanctions on 3 PMF leaders, including 2 mentioned in the legislation. Notably, Treasury also designated a senior Iraqi politician for widespread corruption at the expense of the Iraqi people. This is a good start and must be followed up with more action. I urge the administration to continue making a strong stance on this issue, and I hope this committee will take up the Iraqi Human Rights and Accountability Act. Thank you to our witnesses, Principal Assistant Deputy Joey Hood, for your service to our country and for being here today. The situation in Iraq and across the region is complex, and we trust you know that you have your work cut out for you. I look forward to hearing how Congress can play an effective role in demanding human rights for the people of Iraq and holding those that are violating them in account. Thank you again, Chairman Deutsch, for your leadership. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Wilson, and please extend to your sons our thanks for their service. I will now recognize members of the subcommittee for a 1-minute opening statement. Should they choose to make one? Seeing none, without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations in the rules. And it's now my pleasure to introduce our witness. Mr. Joey Hood is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. He has spent much of his career working in the Middle East and has served as Deputy Chief of Mission in Iraq and in Kuwait, as well as Consul General and Principal Officer in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. Prior to these assignments, Mr. Hood was Acting Director of the Office of Iranian Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. During his time in the Foreign Service, Mr. Hood also served in Riyadh and Asmara and was assigned to the U.S. embassies in Yemen and Qatar. Thank you, Mr. Hood, for being with us today. Let me remind the witness to please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Without objection, your prepared written statement will be made a part of the hearing record. Again, we're grateful for your participation today, and you are recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, members of the committee. Let me also recognize and thank you for the service of those on the committee, as well as Alan and Addison Wilson for their service to our country in Iraq. I know from firsthand experience it's not very easy there. But I'm honored to be with you today to discuss U.S. policy in Iraq and where we go from here. As we've all seen, public demonstrations have swept Baghdad and the southern provinces, and what began as a wave of primarily Iraqi youth objecting to the perceived firing of a respected war hero soon grew into a broader movement demanding the elimination of corruption, endemic corruption, and greater economic opportunity, with demonstrators spanning religious sects, gender, occupations, and generational lines. The demonstrators are rightfully tired of living under bad governance and want more from their leaders. Hundreds of Iraqis have been killed, as you have both mentioned, and as many as 20,000 injured so far, prompting the United States to speak out loudly and frequently to say, stop the killing, bring the killers to justice, and protect the people's right to express themselves freely, including through public demonstrations and free access to the media and the internet. Not surprisingly, another element of Iraq's protest movement, as you have pointed out, has been rejection of Iran's corrupting influence, including anger at Iranian-supported political parties and armed groups. As you rightly pointed out, in the last couple of weeks, Qasem Soleimani, the head of Iran's so-called Quds Force and chief exporter of terrorism, was widely reported to have been in Baghdad, meeting with, threatening, and cajoling politicians. This is exactly the type of unacceptable interference Iraqis are protesting in the streets. Iraqis are also demanding an end to Iran's mobster rules. Tehran arms terrorist groups like Kataib Hezbollah and Asa'ib al-Haq, as you mentioned. It manipulates political party leaders, but it also floods the Iraqi market with cheap, low-quality food. It hawks counterfeit and expired pharmaceuticals and dumps illicit narcotics on the markets as well. At the same time, many Iraqis have rejected being painted as tools of American influence. Although many protesters are too young to remember Saddam's tyranny, they're all intimately familiar with the shortcomings of their political elites, whose rise to power many attribute to the United States. So in that context, it's imperative that the United States remain, as Secretary Pompeo has said, a force for good across the region. We offer a partnership that's unmatched. It reflects our values and contributes to the security and stability that people need to address the aspirations of the protesters. As Secretary Pompeo has said, the United States welcomes any serious efforts to address their demands. But nothing will change until political leaders decide that government agencies should provide public services rather than serve as ATM machines for their parties. And until that happens, the people's demands for a clean and effective government will not be met, no matter who serves as prime minister or in the cabinet. As the Secretary has said, we'll use all the tools at our disposal, including designations under the Global Magnitsky Act, just like we did last week, to hold people accountable. We will also remain the country's largest humanitarian donor. Since 2014 alone, we spent more than $2.6 billion on aid like food, water, medicine, and shelter. We're also the largest donor to stabilization, rehabilitating more than 500 schools, 100 health centers, and 50 water treatment plants. We're the largest donor to demining, clearing over 86 million square meters of land since 2015, so more than 4 million displaced Iraqis could go home and live their lives in safety. This is what we mean when we say we're a force for good in Iraq. Our relationship with Iraq remains vital for U.S. national security interests. Bolstering Iraq as a sovereign, stable, united, and democratic partner of the United States continues to be our principal objective. The administration believes that a strong Kurdistan regional government within a unified and federal Iraq is also essential to Iraq's long-term stability, so we'll continue to work with Baghdad and Erbil to resolve outstanding sources of tension. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hood. I appreciate your being here. We'll now turn to the member questions. Subject to the 5-minute rule, I'll begin, and then we'll alternate going to the ranking member next. Does the State Department recognize, the State Department believe that the drawdown of U.S. diplomats has hindered our ability to achieve our policy objectives in Iraq and put the country on a positive trajectory? And what specific steps, I guess, depending upon the answer to that question, what specific steps has the Department taken to make up for the reduction in U.S. personnel?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. The short answer is no. We don't believe that the change in staffing levels has hindered our abilities to do our jobs there. And in fact, when we went on order departure in the middle of May, it was due to credible, new, and very serious threats. And so when any post goes on order departure, there is a large reduction in staff for a temporary period of time. So in this case, it went until the beginning of November, as you mentioned. And during that time, between middle May and the beginning of November, we continued to take a serious look at our staff, a look that had begun many months before, to decide what the minimal level of staffing was required to achieve our objectives as set out by the President's national security strategy for Iraq. And that's the level that we implemented after the lifting of ordered departure, something that we have consulted with congressional staff on, and we formally notified the Congress of recently. I am very willing and available to come and talk in a classified session about specific numbers. We don't tend to get into those discussions for security reasons in an open setting, but I would also urge you to visit as soon as you can so that you can see for yourselves the great job that Ambassador Tueller and his team are doing. By any measure, in terms of cables written, in terms of meetings conducted, in terms of advocacy conducted, in terms of visits to locations off of the embassy compound, we see this team being incredibly effective at getting the job done.
I appreciate the offer, Mr. Hood, and I think we'll take you up on the opportunity to have a full discussion in the appropriate setting. In a November 30th statement, protesters in 10 Iraqi provinces listed 7 demands, including ongoing protests until parties disappear and the quota system ends, amendment of the Constitution, a fair electoral law, and a new electoral commission, early elections under UN supervision, and accountability for all those implicated in killing protesters. What's the State Department's opinion of these demands, and how is the State Department working to move forward to help ensure that they're met?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think we need to be careful because one of the unique features of this movement is that it doesn't have defined leadership. So there isn't a revolutionary committee or coordinating committee that can issue statements on behalf of all the thousands of people in the street. That said, our embassy team is in contact with civil society organizations, with a broad range of people from academia and from the media and all across Iraqi society. And the demands that we're hearing from them, as well as from people in the streets, are demands that we've been hearing for quite a while, which is an end to endemic corruption, elected representatives who actually represent the will of the people, and not just the same faces year in and year out, no matter what the election results are. So you now see the Council of Representatives taking up new legislation for electoral reform. We certainly applaud that. The United Nations Assistance Mission to Iraq is providing advice and assistance. That's part of their mandate, and we think that that's essential for there to be real change. But as I said in my opening remarks, if the political leaders, not just those who are elected, but the political party leaders, if they don't fundamentally accept that change is necessary and vital, then nothing is going to be different, no matter what faces they put.
How best, Mr. Hood, how best can they exhibit their understanding of that? What would be the most significant step they could take?
I think electoral reform is obviously important, but there are other measures. We say that this is up to the Iraqis to decide how they want to move forward and how they meet the demands of their own people. But what we say is we've got a hand that we're putting out to you. We will help you whenever we see credible partners in the government who want to make positive change. So fighting corruption, reforming the civil service, the electoral reforms I've talked about, ending their dependence on Iranian energy, for example. It makes no sense for the Iraqis to be flaring gas up into the atmosphere and losing billions of dollars while also importing gas and electricity from Iran in order to make electricity. It is literally like carrying coals to Newcastle. So we and our technical teams are ready and waiting to help them make these changes as soon as we see a credible desire to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Wilson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary, thank you for your service and extensive throughout the Middle East. It's very, very impressive in your dedication. Thank you. The Iraqi people want to take their government back so it works for them and not for their Iranian domination. In that vein, have we determined if any U.S. foreign assistance has ended up in the hands of Iranian-backed militias in Iraq? And does our current foreign aid assistance framework have safeguards that we can use to ensure that the aid does not support the Iranian influence in Iraq or endemic public corruption?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. The answer is that, yes, we have a lot of systems in place to make sure that our assistance, doesn't go to the armed groups that are supported by the Iranians and are outside the control of the central government. We have full-time staff dedicated to overseeing these vetting efforts, and I would respectfully push back on that OIG report that said that there was a lapse in that oversight. There absolutely has not been. That is one of our top priorities at the mission, to make sure that all human rights vetting, all security vetting is done fully. And in terms of our security assistance. In terms of our humanitarian assistance, we have about a dozen layers of oversight that I can explain in a more closed session to you or to your staff, to make sure that our assistance goes to the right people. And even at our level of Ambassador Tuller or myself or Assistant Secretary Schenker, when we're in the country, we go to a lot of these locations to make sure that our projects are actually being done, they're being branded, so that people can see that this assistance is coming from the American people.
Well, thank you. That's very encouraging. I'm grateful that the Trump administration has taken a strong stance against Iranian-backed militias in Iraq with American blood on their hands. Can you please explain to the subcommittee, like other groups such as Asaba al-Haq, AAH, and the Badr Corps are not designated as terrorist groups?
Well, Congressman, I can't get into internal deliberations about these things, and we certainly don't talk about designations before they happen, but these are issues that we obviously take very seriously. We're always taking in new information and always evaluating it to see what can stand up to the evidentiary standard. As you know, the Global Magnitsky Act has quite a high and serious level of evidentiary standard, and so we need to make sure that these designations can stand up in court. I know that's not what you asked about. You asked about a terrorism designation, but likewise, those are very, very serious and high standards as well. So we have to make sure that when we go that route, that it's an open and shut case.
And indeed, we appreciate the thoroughness of what you're doing. Prime Minister Abdullah Mahdi tendered his resignation late last month, but the people of Iraq are still in the streets. What kind of government response is required to begin to meet the demands of the Iraqi protesters?
That's a good question, Congressman, and it's one that, frankly, I don't have a full answer to, because it really depends on what the Iraqi people perceive from their government. They have to believe that their government and the party leaders who put representatives into that government are ready and willing to make real and substantive changes. It's true that many of these changes can't happen overnight, but certainly with an expression of credibility and by taking some initial measures, they can certainly reassure the people that they're on the right path. First and foremost, they could stop having Qasem Soleimani come to Baghdad and meet with him. They could say, no more of this. I want a normal relationship with Tehran. I want to have normal bilateral trade. I want to have tourism. I want to have normal relationships. That means maybe talking to the Iranian ambassador and not talking to a special forces commander about politics. They could start with that very visibly. They could also start by issuing clean contracts to reputable companies from Iraq and from around the world. The people know corruption and Iranian involvement when they see it. And I think they would also see it if their government and their leaders started pushing back on it.
And thank you again for your extraordinary diplomatic service. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Malinowski, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Hood. I'm actually going to begin off topic just for a second to follow up on Chairman's reference to the horrible shooting in Saudi Arabia. And I want to ask you, as an NEA representative here today, about a specific aspect of that, and that is vetting of Saudi officers under the Leahy Law. You may not be able to give me a detailed answer today, but I am curious to know whether this particular officer had been vetted under the Leahy Law. Why do we have Saudi airmen training in the United States, given the widespread commission of human rights abuses by the Saudi Air Force in the conduct of its air operations in Yemen? Have we devetted? Have we denied training opportunities to any Saudis under the Leahy Law as a result of their conduct in Yemen? I think this whole tragic incident has cast a light on this program, and that's something that immediately leapt to my mind. And would appreciate it if you have anything to say now, but would also appreciate it if you guys could come back to us with more detailed answers to those questions.
Thank you, Congressman. There are some aspects of it that I can answer now and some that I'll have to take back to get more information. But our hearts go out to the victims and their families of this terrible tragedy in Pensacola. The killer is dead, and so there's no more information that we can get from him. But we certainly, I know that the authorities are following up with a number of his classmates and others to get to the bottom of what happened and why. I can say with confidence that we fully implement the Leahy Law. I don't know exactly, what level of scrutiny this individual underwent or his unit, but I can say with confidence that the Leahy Law was applied. I will get back to you on the questions, the other questions that you asked about, but I will say in general that the International Military Education Training Program is one of our crown jewels of exchange programs around the world. It exposes future important leaders in military organizations around the world to the United States, to our views on the law of armed conflict, which is always part of any IMET program.
Understood. Yeah, we want to make sure they're the right leaders, though. So let me move back to Iraq, and I want to challenge you a little bit on the staffing situation. You talked about an ordered departure. An ordered departure at the State Department is something that sometimes has to be done. It is never something that anybody wants to be done, because we generally believe our people should remain in place because they're doing important work. I'm not sure if I find credible the explanation that following an ordered departure, coincidentally, the department decided that it didn't need those people there in the first place. So I'm wondering, is that really what you're suggesting, that you after this review, you decided that we actually did not need those people doing that work? And if not, then why aren't we sending them back? Did we not need a consulate in Basra, for example? Is this what the department has decided, thanks to this ordered departure? We're not going to have a consulate in Basra now, is that correct?
Well, Congressman, let me take it back a number of months. The suspension of operations in Basra happened in the fall of 2018. The ordered departure happened in May of 2019. And you're absolutely right in what you say, that no diplomat ever wants to implement ordered departure because it feels like a failure. And I felt that very keenly because I was the one in charge of the mission at the time, and I was the one who requested it from Washington. And I did it with a very heavy heart. But I did it because I was convinced that these threats were very serious.
Well, understood, and I'm acknowledging that. But the question is, why aren't people going back? And you're suggesting that following that difficult, solemn decision, the department underwent a review and decided that, well, maybe we don't need those people there in the first place. Well, what were they doing
No,
that we
understood,
don't
sorry.
need done anymore?
I wasn't finished
Yeah.
with my explanation. So immediately, we started to look at the question of what if these threats remain at a high level? We're not going to be able to remain at ordered departure forever. So we have to decide what is the smallest number of people that we can have here, making our target as small as it can be, so as not to give the enemy too much of a target, but also to get our mission done. This followed on work that we had started in January, and even previously, but more formally in January, to look at exactly what our staffing levels ought to be. Because in December, the Iraqi government had declared all of its territory liberated from ISIS. This was in December of 2018. We knew that our mission was evolving. Staffing at Mission Iraq has gone up and down over the years in conjunction with the changing environment around it. So our staffing in 2014 looked very different in 2015 once ISIS was 60 miles from the embassy. Likewise, our staffing looked very different in 2017 and 2018. So there was a review process already underway, but
So you've decided that the correct number for Basra is 0.
I'll get to Basra in a second, but it took on new urgency with the ordered departure, and we realized that we needed to very quickly decide what was the minimal number of staffing that we required to get the job done that was before us. In Basra in the fall, there were serious and credible threats there as well that preceded the ordered departure that led us to suspend operations there. And that's where things remain for now.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Kinzinger is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here and your good work for the country. A lot of times our diplomats and diplomatic corps don't get the credit they deserve, and sometimes conflicts averted don't get, it's like stopping a terrorist attack too. You never know it was ever stopped. So I want to thank you for that. Obviously Iran's a huge problem in Iraq. I'm a veteran of that conflict. We operated against, both terrorists and Iranians in Iraq, and we know that a quarter of American soldiers were killed directly or indirectly by Iran. You look at Yemen. Yemen was mentioned earlier. We know why Yemen is destabilized because of Iran. They overthrew a legitimate government. They give no humanitarian aid. They store weapons in cities so that the civilian casualties increase. And somehow they've gotten not a lot of attention for that. But I'm deeply saddened by the instability we see, obviously, across Iraq. Over the past 3 months, these protests have claimed more than 400 lives, as we expect, maybe, and injured definitely thousands more. It's led primarily by nationalistic sentiments, and the protesters are voicing their anger with Iranian influence and interference. Last year, I introduced the Preventing Destabilization of Iraq Act, which passed with overwhelming support out of this House, and unfortunately, because of one or two specific senators, did not pass the Senate. But if it had been signed into law 2 years ago, we may have easily prevented some of the pain and suffering that the Iraqi people are dealing with today, and I hope we can learn from our mistakes. Disengaging or using rhetoric about bring everybody home. It's a mistake we made with the end of the Status of Forces Agreement in Iraq. We all know that was extended under President Bush so that the next president could have the courtesy of making a decision whether or not to stay in Iraq, and we didn't, and we see the results of that now, and hopefully that is a mistake we don't make again. But I want to ask you specifically, so ensuring the stability of Iraq is key to our national security strategy, and that's where I want to begin. While the parties in Iraq have promised to make much-needed electoral reforms that are being demanded by their citizens, these could fail unless Iranian influence is curtailed. So I'm not suggesting that we cut off Iraq from Iran entirely. I don't think that's feasible. It's a 1,500-mile long border. But we must work with the authorities in Iraq to push back against Iran's destabilizing actions. So the Ayatollahs through the IRGC have spent a considerable amount of time and resources developing the influence gained in Iraq. Does the IRGC's leadership feel pressure from these protests? And if so, what steps are they taking to shore up their support, and how can we counter that?
I believe they do feel pressure from the protests, which is one of the reasons why they deployed Qasem Soleimani so quickly and for such a long period of time. And I think what they're doing now is they're having trouble figuring out how to reinstate the influence that they feel that they're losing. And unfortunately, I think you see it in the form of armed people who are infiltrating the protests, especially at night. Even as we speak, even as I was coming in here, I saw reports of armed men going around and shooting in a particular area. And, you know, if they think they're going to win hearts and minds of the Iraqis with that, they're sadly mistaken. And I think if they believe that they're going to cow the Iraqis into acquiescence, I think they're also mistaken. I think this young generation there is fed up, and they feel that they have nothing to lose. And so what we need to do is we need to make sure that those Iraqis understand that once they have leaders in place who are willing to change, we're willing to work with them. We have a $22 trillion economy. We've got amazing businesses that work not on the basis of corruption. We've got security assistance that's bar none the best in the world. And we've got a very generous public willing to provide humanitarian assistance and all sorts of help. So,
and let me just ask you briefly, is there any counter information, any disinformation when you talk about those killings where they're blaming it on somebody that folks are believing, or is it well understood that it's the Iranian security services that are coming in to do this stuff?
you know, it's well understood that, you know, people refer to the third party as the euphemism, meaning it's not the Iraqi government and it's not the Iraqi people. Now, you do have unfortunately, armed groups that are starting to fight each other. And that is the recipe for disaster. So we know that the protesters have been trying to make an effort recently to make sure that armed infiltrators can't make their way in, but they can only do so much. The Iraqi security forces must protect the people and their right to protest peacefully. That's what we call on them to do, and we think they're capable of doing it.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Trone, you're recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Hood, thank you for your service. With the Iraqi parliament beginning to select a new prime minister, will the United States work with that new Iraqi prime minister if we believe that Iran has had too much influence on it and is perhaps too close to that individual?
Congressman, we will work with anyone willing to make real change in Iraq. You know, it's just possible that the Iranians may think that they've got their candidate in there, but that person may stand up and say, I'm an Iraqi national, I'm an Iraqi patriot, you know, I'm on the side of my people. That's always possible. So we're not going to try to call the horse race now and say, you know, we'll back that one and not this one. We will wait until we see what the Iraqi people decide. And if there is a credible leader willing to put Iraq's interests first, we don't care what his or her name is. We are going to be willing to work with that person to give Iraqis a better future, because that's in our interest.
Let's talk about USAID reducing staffing. Again, same theme. They've reduced their staffing by 80% in Iraq, yet they've dramatically increased programming, including the new $100 million stabilization assistance in the Anbar province, a $7 million financial assistance to support ethnic religious minorities, bringing total USAID assistance to $1.16 billion. Why Do such significant staffing reductions make sense while programming's increasing, especially when the programming is going to a lot of small, new, untested governmental organizations, and we only have 5 USAID staff left in the entire country? How's that going to work?
Well, Congressman, I would respectfully disagree with all the numbers that you put out there. They're not accurate, and I would be willing to come and talk in a closed session about what the numbers actually are, what they were, and what we think they will be moving ahead. But nobody believes in those programs more than I. I was a huge champion of the assistance to Anbar because I went out to Fallujah and I saw these tribal sheikhs sitting in a huge room like this and saying, yes, we wanted to kill you before, but now we want to be partners with you. And I said, okay, if that's the bargain, we'll be here to help. That's the partnership that we offer. The religious and ethnic minorities, I can't tell you what a feeling it is to be in a half-destroyed monastery and to know that our money is going to restore that from what ISIS tried to do with it. I'm reminded every single day from things like this that I wear. This is the Lord's Prayer in Aramaic. To be sitting in a mass among Chaldean Christians and to hear them recite this prayer in the language of Jesus is just one of the most moving experiences you can have in your lifetime. So no one more than we want to protect those programs and make sure that those people can go home and live their lives in safety. We would never agree to staffing cuts so severe that they would put those programs in jeopardy.
Well, if you could get back to the committee and help us get the right numbers, that's what we had. More than 1.5 million individuals remain internally displaced in Iraq, and Iraqi officials have identified $88 billion in recovery needs. How's the U.S. going to be able to help Iraq meet these challenges? And what's the State Department doing to assist the Iraqi government in restoring civil documentation for more than 1 million IDPs, many who lost their identification, confiscated, destroyed by ISIS, and it cannot access, vital health care and education services without it? How can we help?
Those are good questions, Congressman, because we have a lot to offer in that regard. For the reconstruction needs of the country, of course, we don't rebuild countries. We do provide stabilization so that there's water and electricity and those essential services so that then businesses can come in and do their work. Iraq is a middle-income country. They're one of the largest oil producers in the world. They don't need, nor should they want, our aid money to provide reconstruction. They should be ready and willing to hire competent, clean companies to do that. Unfortunately, we're not seeing that just yet for many of the reasons that we talked about here earlier. There's endemic corruption that is preventing this from taking place. But our companies are ready. We are there advocating for them. They just need a good, reliable partner in the Iraqi government. And I know that that's true for other governments as well. In Kuwait, we, with other governments, provided investment guarantees and loan guarantees of more than $30 billion for these reconstruction efforts. Almost none of it has been taken advantage of because the government has so far not been willing to come forward and fund projects that our companies would be willing to go in for.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Vargas, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And again, thank you for holding this hearing, and the ranking member, thank you. Mr. Hood, again, thank you for your service. I appreciate it. We all do, as was stated earlier. I do want to ask some questions, if I could, about the Kurds in Kurdistan. So I did have the opportunity some years ago to meet with the Kurds in the Peshmerga with a colleague of ours at the time, Daryl Issa, and really what they were asking for at the time was the ability to defend themselves, and not only that, but to help us in those areas that you mentioned. Interestingly, it was very moving to hear you talk about Jesus and the Lord's Prayer in Aramaic. We in San Diego have a number of Chaldeans that have moved to San Diego, and they've of course, become wonderful citizens, and most of them live a little outside of my district, but I have relationships with them because I have been to Iraq a few times now. But how are things going there? When I went there to Erbil, it was interesting to me to see how hardworking the people were, and even within that very difficult situation of the fights, they were doing quite well. You saw cranes everywhere, and there was still a lot of optimism. Even though the fighting, we could see literally the fires from where we were, the smoke at least, not the fires. What is happening there right now? If you could give us some information.
Well, thank you, Congressman, for those kind words and for reminding me of Darrell Issa. I was fortunate to host him on a CODEL, not just in Baghdad before he retired, but also in Yemen a number of years ago, where he was part of the first CODEL in something like 15 years to visit that country. So it's just a way of me saying it's really important for us to see you out in those countries, and we hope that you will come and visit Baghdad and Erbil and maybe Sulaymaniyah, because there's a lot going on in the Kurdistan region. They obviously have their challenges. We are helping them to overcome those as much as we can through dedicated assistance to the Peshmerga. We're trying to help them convert those from party militias into combined forces that are responsive to their central government, to their regional government, and to the central government. And we're providing a lot of assistance as well for them to help deal with the refugees from Syria and from the internally displaced people, including the Yazidis, almost all of whom who are displaced are in the Kurdistan region. And their going home requires an agreement between Baghdad and Erbil on how to administer their homeland. And so far, we haven't seen that progress, and we keep pushing for it at every level very frequently.
What about the issue, though, if you could address a little bit the issue of the oil? I know that there was discussions going on there. They were trying to get to some arrangement with the Prime Minister, and that has seemed to fall by the wayside. Is there some reconciliation? What is going on there?
There are a lot of talks. That's one of the promising things that we saw with the Adel Abdel-Mahdi administration. He did have a lot of confidence from the Kurdish leaders, and we received reports very frequently that there was progress being made. It's easy to get a little cynical when you hear those reports over and over, but no actual results. But it is true that now the talks seem to be paused with the resignation of the Prime Minister and the focus of the government in Baghdad on the protests. So we hope that a new government will take up those negotiations with the Kurds as quickly as possible and sincerely as possible to get a deal so that the different parts of Iraq can be helping each other, as I said earlier, get off of a dependence on Iranian energy, because that doesn't serve anybody's purposes.
I appreciate that. Well, again, I hope and wish the best, and obviously we want to see the transition from this government to something else to be successful, but I guess like many of my colleagues, I'm very afraid of the influence that Iran has now, and that I think is very, very problematic, especially up in what I would call the Nineveh Plain, for lack of a better biblical term, but that area is important for Chaldeans and for Christians.
Yeah.
And again, I wish you the best.
Yazidis as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Vargas. Mr. Keating, would you like to be recognized? You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope I'm not covering old ground, but I was just curious. The protests are centering about many issues, the influence of Iran being one, but also the economic conditions and the fact that young people don't have a lot of opportunity or hope. It's a recurrent theme around the world, frankly. But what about some of the USAID or some of the developmental money that could be used where we might want to put more emphasis there? Because clearly we have an interest in stability, and I think that's one way we could truly have an avenue maybe where there's a vacuum.
Well, thank you for that, for those questions and observations, Congressman. We Our programs actually are focused on the areas that we think the demonstrators are most interested in, which is ending endemic corruption and improving the ability of the government to provide essential services. And so that may take the form of technical assistance in getting rid of ghost workers from the civil service payrolls. That may be learning how to do trash pickup better throughout a particular province. We've had successive programs like this administered by USAID and others that have tried to work with willing partners within the government, but it's an uphill battle. Because, as I've said earlier, the political parties up until now have seen ministries and government offices as ATM machines for their parties and not as agencies that must provide services to their publics. So until we have partners like that throughout the government, we're not going to be able to make much progress.
Are they, I just remember with the military in Afghanistan, the Afghan security and other places, when they went to digital payments, that was something that took an avenue of corruption away. Are they doing that in Iraq? Are most of these municipalities or some of the civil work that's being done, are they paying people digitally so that it's not, it's going directly to the people that are working?
Not enough, Congressman. And it's one of our highest priorities that we convey to the Minister of Finance and to the Deputy Prime Minister in the Kurdistan region, who are partners with us and who are working toward digital payments as much as possible.
Is it a technological barrier they have, or they just don't want to do it?
Well, it's both, Congressman. I think it's safe to say that there is a psychological, to be fair, there is a psychological element for people who have been at war in one form or another for over 40 years, that they like the cash and they like to put it in their mattresses, so that if they have to flee, they've got it. Or if another dictator comes in, they are not so beholden. Or if the banks get robbed, they don't have to worry. The banking system is nascent to non-existent, and so that's another big part of the problem. But
Could we help at all in that regard?
yes, sir, and we are. I know that our Treasury attaché works on this as a full-time job, and in the Kurdistan region, we're working with His Excellency Qubad Talabani, the Deputy Prime Minister, on these very issues through a USAID program that he's taken very well advantage
Well,
of.
lastly, something you just said about people's dissatisfaction and the corruption that surrounds just the regular dispensation of local services, whether it's trash pickup or basic public works or other activities. Is it possible that as you're looking at those kind of actions, that could be a window in for ISIS? I know that in Syria and other areas, when there was really rampant corruption and the people weren't getting services, they would slowly ingrain themselves within a community, and then they start to build up trust, and then eventually try and influence those things and get a foothold in a community like that. Is there any opportunity to do that ISIS might take advantage of, or is it just too far advanced in Iraq so that would be an issue?
I think, Congressman, that was the case in 2014 when people were just completely fed up with their government. Again, at that time, and many of them saw a difference with ISIS. But that is absolutely no longer the case. There is no longer any Iraqis who would fall for that. They are virtually united in their hatred for this organization. And so while there are obviously pockets here and there, just like in other countries, the Iraqi security forces, backed up by support from people and intelligence networks and from the international coalition led by the United States, they're really taking the fight to those ISIS remnants.
Well, my time is up, but in writing, I'd probably follow up and ask you on the question I talked about before, the banking infrastructure, what we could do, that kind of work. Perhaps private entities in the U.S. could work in dealing with that. But I'll do that in writing, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. And I thank the witness, Mr. Hood. Thanks very much for being here. Thanks to the members for participating. Mr. Hood, we're grateful for your testimony and for your service to our country. Members of the subcommittee, as Mr. Keating just referenced, may have some additional questions. We ask that you please respond to those questions in writing, and I'd ask that my colleagues, to the extent they have questions, submit them to the subcommittee clerk within 5 business days. And with that, without any objection, the subcommittee is adjourned.
Thank you.